Alright, so welcome to this first video tutorial for Grasshopper. And this video I'm gonna explain a few basic aspects of how Grasshopper works and things that you could keep in mind, and a few tips that you can improve your workflow using Grasshopper. So one of the first things that I think is good to keep in mind is that in a few videos, if you look online and you go to YouTube and try to learn through more video tutorials around the web, you're gonna find some videos to have these icons, and some videos to have text, and some videos to have more things, like in here that I have the name of the component on top. There's a few little details that you can do to change these things. One important is the draw icons. This is the default that Grasshopper has, so it's just the text. But if you click that one, draw icons, it will show the icons in all the components, and it might be easier for you to find what the components are for, and also kind of relate everything that you put on the canvas, the Grasshopper canvas, with the toolbar, so you can follow a little bit better what you're trying to do. I have these names as well. You might be wondering and curious. It's just an extra component that is called, if I'm not wrong, bifocals. Actually, yeah, I can find it here. It's not by default in Grasshopper. You don't really need it. It's just for the sake of doing tutorials that the only thing that it does is to show the name of the components in there. But it does an extra plugin that you will have to download if you want to have it in there. Okay. Now, to start understanding a little bit more about Grasshopper, I would say it's important to think first of the basic parameters that you can use and what they mean. I have here some of the most used components, or you could say data or information that is used in Grasshopper. As architects, we're definitely going to use these ones. Some basic shapes or geometry is point, line, curve, surface, and B-rep. Important to keep in mind, line and curve, sometimes Grasshopper make a differentiation between those two. Recommendation is by default use curve all the time, and if at any point you see this icon in one of the components that you're using is asking you for that one, and you connect a curve and it's giving you an error, it might be just that. And something that you can do is simply take the curve, bring one of these line components that is here in the geometry tab. You can find all of those basic geometries in here, and that will convert the data that is inside the curve into a line. I'm not gonna go into the nitty-gritty of why is that, how is Grasshopper understanding that. Here's something that you can keep in mind. Then we have in the area of coordinates, a plane and a vector. We can have next numbers and text, and good to differentiate as well. Number by default is anything that has decimal numbers, and an integer is an entire number without any decimal points. And sometimes it will give you issues if Grasshopper is looking for absolute number and you give it a decimal point number. So sometimes as well to keep to keep in mind, as it happens with line and curve. Finally, a few ones that will be common to find around is rectangle, mesh, and boolean. That sometimes have this component as an example. That this component is asking for a rectangular array cell, and by description a lot of components might be confusing, or the description doesn't make sense if you don't really understand what it's asking you for, if you haven't been working around programming for a while. And that's when the icons might be useful to have a look at. That in this case, as you can see, I'm gonna just move this around so it's easier to look next to the other one. As you can see, the icon that is asking in the description is exactly the one that is called rectangle. And again, it's a little bit confusing and might not make much sense at the beginning, but try to match those icons where you're not sure what information you need to put in the input of the component. So let's move it back in here. We're gonna see how this works in just a moment. So really important just to keep in mind something as well relevant to remember is that all these components that are here in the geometry tab, they're empty components. It's just as a reference or to convert one type of information to another or to grab some information. One of the most common uses is to create or bring a geometry from Rhino that I have here in behind into Grasshopper. For example, a point. If you click any of these components, actually, you will have the option to set one or multiple things. In this case, points will let you do that. Vectors as well. Mesh, set one, multiple. Some might change. Some might let you input the information yourself when you go into those options. But just to introduce information, in this case, let's say if I click in the set one point, it will let me set one by one. As you can see, if I click the set one point, it will only let me have one. And that's why it's differentiating between one and multiple. If I will have multiple points, I will have to be careful on using always that second option. And as you can see now, this information you can move it in Rhino, and that's one of the things. And you can do the same. For example, let's do this. You can also empty the parameter just by going here into clear values. Now let's do the opposite. Let's create go into Rhino a polyline and just create one basic polyline. There you go. And the way to bring it into Grasshopper is just right click, one curve, select, and then you have the curve. And then you can move things around. Something as well that it can be useful is that every time that you bring something from Rhino into Grasshopper, if you don't want to keep using it in Rhino, if you want just to save the Grasshopper file, that sometimes is better or quicker to just move one file instead to having Rhino and Grasshopper at the same time. You can go right click, internalize that, and now you can delete everything from Rhino and it won't give you any error. If you don't internalize the data, let's go Control Z that I'm pressing, and if I delete the data, this one curve now is attached. You can see if I move the curve, it's going to be attached, but if I delete the curve, it's going to empty the information from that component. So it's also important to keep in mind that sometimes you are working in Grasshopper and you're working inside a Rhino file, you bring some geometry from that Rhino file and then you save everything, but you try to use the Grasshopper file after and something is not working, or something is red, or something is orange, and it seems that something is just not going well. Might be that you had some geometry in Rhino that you attached to Grasshopper and now you don't have it anymore. So it's going to give you those issues. Okay, let's now go to the exercise. Let's first use this two rectangle components. And this is a component that it might be a little bit confusing sometimes, that if you go into the description and you see the icon, you see the example value that is giving you. Let me just actually empty this. This is just the rectangle component. I'm bring a new one, rectangle. And you see that it's going -1 to 1. And by logic, the first thing that you will try to do is just give it a number, let's say 100, and maybe make it 50, and you go, okay, 50, it's working fine. That might be the case, and I actually recommend you to just do what I did in there. Just put the component in the canvas and see what happens if you plug something in there. Just go to the description, try to look at the icon and see That's a plane, so what can I do with the plane? Maybe I can change the plane. And planes, actually you can bring any basic plane by typing the generic coordinates like x, z, y, z, x, y, and you can plug that into the plane component, and any component that is asking you for a plane or that has the icon of a plane, you can plug in any plane that you want. That will become quite useful when you're starting to rotate things and start working with more complex geometries, that it won't be attached to the plane, to the base plane, like to the ground. It will be attached to the surface of a building, and the surface is inclined, and then things start to get complicated. You can start working with the plane. That's why this rectangle has that plane input. For now, let's just keep it in the original coordinates, that actually if you delete everything, you can see in the information that it gives you as default is one locally defined value is xy, that if I connect it in here, xy is going to be the same. And sometimes I actually like to do this to just be able to right click and preview the values. So I clean a little bit of the Rhino viewport, so it's easier to see. Something else that you can do sometimes is just to right click and extract parameter. That's what I like to do, and that way I can turn off that, and as you can see, when I turn it off, it's not in that anymore. It cleans up things a little bit. I like doing that. And now what happens then if I use the component that seems to be asking me for, which is that icon in there, that, let's see, this would be the process that I would recommend everybody to do. I see that icon is the line with two more lines intersecting that one, and just go up in here, trying to find it, and see if you can find it somewhere else. And sometimes it might be confusing. Or sometimes you can just extract that and just click this. Lots of way to find your way around the software. And this one is actually quite useful. If you right click and extract the parameter, and then you press Ctrl Alt and click, hold the click, pressing all of those at the same time, and you go to what it's asking you for, and you can find the name of that component or the information that it's asking you for. And here it's asking for a domain. Then how can you find a domain? You double click and type domain, and you start to put all the components in the canvas that you find and see what you can do. That if I type domain, it's actually a lot of them, and the one that we need is actually not the first that appears. It's actually right here at the top. The first that appear are the basic parameters, but again, this one, just keep in mind everything that it has the icon like this, that is black and white, is the empty parameter, the base parameter that you give information to. So if you try to use any of those, it won't work. Same if I type curve, it will give you that one. If I type line, it will give you that one, but none of those will work. They just completely empty for you to give them information. So anytime that you see one of those black and white components, keep in mind that's not going to give you any information. If I go back into domain, again, there's a lot of them. Just try to see if any of the components seems to give you something that might work. And also, the next step that I would keep in mind is just look at the default information that is giving you. So it's from one number to another, -1 to 1. And little by little you can find some of the components that you need. I know at the beginning it's quite confusing, it's a lot of components and it might take you some time, and you will have to be patient to really find your way around. And that's when tutorials on YouTube and just asking someone that knows about Grasshopper will come handy, just to really quickly start to learn all the components, because there's a lot of them, so it will take some time. Keep in mind all these tricks. Try to extract the parameters, Control Alt and click and see the name of those components and see what those are doing, and try to drag and drop information and try to connect, and little bit later you will get more and more familiar with all the components. Always go, like for example, actually I never use this component, and I would just go here. Okay, it's asking me for a curve, so what happens if I make a curve, and really quickly you can test things out. I'm just gonna make a random curve in here. Let's bring a curve, right click, set one curve, that's gonna be there. What happens if I plug in a curve? Okay, it's just giving me another curve, and it's asking again for a domain, so this is not the one that I'm gonna need for this domain. It's not the same, it's still asking for that one. So then you go back into the main, and a little bit later you can start looking for what you need. That's just a little bit of advice for you to experiment with Grasshopper. I know it's a little bit scary or confusing to understand, but it's just trying it out and experiment with. And either way, I'm gonna be here all the time to help you out. I'm gonna keep doing some of these tutorials to give you more information, and a little bit later it will be easier and easier to start working with Grasshopper. Okay, to go back into the actual answer of this, is that little icon is this domain, is construct a domain. For those of you who don't know, domain is just simply a number, an information that goes from one number to another number. Call it a range of numbers, which might be confusing because you also have a range in here. But the range is actually you again for a domain. Domain can be quite important to remember because they come along quite often to Grasshopper. So in this case, what happens with rectangle? This rectangle component is actually taking into consideration the 0, 0, 0 point in the Cartesian planes of Rhino. So let me just turn everything off. That you can do that by, if you select something, like in this case I want to turn this rectangle off. You can right click in the center of the component and preview, or what I prefer to do is just select and right click anywhere in the canvas that is empty, and it gives you also the options. Is sometimes easier. And let's work with this component. I'm going to delete this one as well. Now, okay, as I said, I like to do this, extract the parameter and use empty so I can see the actual rectangle, which is this small one. Is using the default information that the component has, that is -1 to -1, -1 to 1, and -2 to 2. And the last one is radius. It's also asking for a number. In this case, it's 0. So radius is just the fillet at the corners. But let's focus in X and Y. Really straightforward. X and Y is just the directions and where the rectangle is going. And here, what -1 to 1 means is that it's taking this 0, 0, 0, it's going -1 and to 1. So making this X direction to be 2 units, so let's say 2 millimeters. And the same for Y is going to take -2 to 2. So from 0 is going to be 1, 2, and -1, -2, making it 4 units. And in Grasshopper is quite straightforward for this one. That is so common to use a rectangle that the software will take a number, even if it's asking you for a range, for a domain. And it's good to keep in mind that sometimes you can work Grasshopper or the components in Grasshopper in different ways. So there's always different ways, different possible ways in which you can use the components. So in this case, you could plug in 100, and what happens is, if you look to the data that is taken, is 0 to 100, and now in Y is 0 to 100. So again, taking from the Cartesian plane, 0, 0, and it's just counting 100 in one direction, 100 in the other direction. And I'm explaining all of this because something really important and really necessary to remember using Grasshopper is that you're playing with data. You're using data to create data. It's not about it's not much about geometry or surface, but the information that is creating those things in the viewport. In this case, we're using the Cartesian plane, the Cartesian coordinates, to create a rectangle. But more than a rectangle is that we're moving information from 0 to 100 and to 0 to 100. And it might sound a little bit too much and unnecessary. Just to create a rectangle, there's so much that goes into it. But the plus, as you might know, looking at parametric modeling, is that it gives you some flexibility to play around. In this case, if I'm doing something really complex, like this array of cubes, now because it's all about the numbers, I can start moving those. Let me just plug this. I'm going to show you how to do that in a moment. I can start editing that information, and everything is going to react more quickly, letting me experiment a lot more with what I'm creating. Where in Rhino and any 3D software that you're working, if you try to interact with the geometry, it will take you some extra time because you have to move and edit things directly. So it's pros and cons that you have in these systems. And again, you can go back. Something really good to keep in mind always is that you can go back into Rhino and do things and move it into Grasshopper. It doesn't have to be all Grasshopper all the time. You can move things around. So sometimes it's actually true that it's easier to make things in the more traditional 3D modeling process in Rhino than trying to figure out how to find a plane or something really strange that it will take a long time and it's not actually worth it. And you'll get used to it after using Grasshopper for a while to understand better what is useful to do in Rhino and what is useful to do in Grasshopper. But the important part right now is for you to understand the logic of the tools that Grasshopper give you. And the main one is understanding that you're using data. You're using data to create information. And from that, I always like to use these panels that you can find here on parameters, input panel. And you can also, you will see me doing this in tutorials really quickly, is to double click and type quotes, press enter. That's going to show you a panel as well. You can also do it by using 2 slashes, whatever feels more quick for you, and plug that into everything that I'm doing, just to see what is it that I'm getting. So in here, you can start going back and forth to see the information, how the information is moving through the components. You can see here that the number that I have in here starts to move in that direction, and it's going to give you width and height. If I was to have a different number in Y, so that's going to change as well, and it's just the numbers flowing through the graph into something more complex, like it would be this one. Which brings it to the next step, that is list, which I'm gonna go deeper into the next exercise. But it's something that you also will have to keep really close attention to. Okay. So after that, you can keep in mind then that you can give it a number to that rectangle, or just give it an actual domain, like is in here, that is 50 to 50. This is how you use the construct domain. It's literally one number to another number. And as you can see, I use a panel here just to visualize what the information is creating. If I plug that in here, you can see that now the rectangle is changing. And what it's doing now, let's actually hide this one and just show the rectangle. What it's doing now, if I use a domain, is taking again, counting from that 0 number, the distance or the units that is moving from that 0. If I go to minus 100 to 100, it's going to be a 200 rectangle. And I can make it go to 0, and now it's going to be just in the opposite direction. A few things to keep in mind. But you can keep it simple as well, just by giving it the 100, and the component knows to make it from 0 to 100. Next thing to keep in mind is how to give it numbers. And I've been using these components all the time. That is, if you type any number, say 20, when you double click, it will create a number slider that you can find here, number slider. And it's really handy to have. You go to one number to one number, you can select all of those. If you double click here in the name, you can be a little bit more, you can set things in any way that you want. You can give it a name even, and change a few things. Use real numbers or natural numbers, even or odd numbers. And then you can minimum, maximum, range, and things like that. Is lots of options that you can do. Something really nice that you can do, use a pro tip, is that if you type a number, let's say you want a slide that goes from 0 to 45, this is how you would create something like that. You just type the first number, then 2 points, and then the last number. And as you can see now, it's going from 0 to 45. And you can be a little more specific and do something like, I want it to go from 0, and I want it to give me 45, and I want it to be the maximum 180, and it will start from that 45. And last thing to keep in mind is that you can also use decimal points. So if I wanted to go to 100, but I wanted to keep 2 decimal points, just add those decimal points, and now you have those in there as well. So a few ways to use those number sliders. All right, and I would say number sliders is the best way to go, because in Grasshopper the idea is to be flexible and change and experiment with things all the time. But you also have the option to use panels to introduce data. And a few ways that you can do that, again, just using the quotes. Let's say that I want to make it a rectangle that is 50, and then you have 50, and you can plug that in and you'll get a rectangle that is 50 quite easily. But then you have to keep in mind that you have to slowly try to type each one of the numbers that you need. And that's when the slider is definitely better, to give you more interactivity. So flexibility to experiment with the numbers. But something really useful when you use panels is that you can create lists if you have a specific numbers that you want to use. And just bear in mind that it will go red if you try to make a list and leave it like that. To actually interpret that information, you have to right click and multiple line data. A list has to have this index that you have in the left of everything. And as you can see, now I have 3 rectangles that is taking that information. You can visualize again what is it that is doing by putting a panel and just looking at how the data is flowing from one side to the other. So I have 29, 29, 29, because it's going the same one to X, the same one to Y. 18, X and Y, so 18 and 18, and 25, X and Y, 25 and 25. And using this list can be really handy to create multiple things. As you can see, it will take as well some time to get used to understanding how the components will create multiple things. But the basic idea is that a component will take each line of information and will try to process that and create something from that information. It's all about the information, the data, the numbers that you're given it. Okay, let's not use this one since we want to experiment a little bit more with this rectangle, X and Y. Now we have this X and Y basic rectangle. It is 100 by 100 millimeters. After that, what I did is to create a surface. I'm gonna turn that on, and then I extruded that surface, which is quite common in any 3D software. That's quite a straightforward process that everybody follows. And now, something to keep in mind is that if you use, let's turn this off and this off, the way that you copy things is by start dragging any component and press Alt, and it will give you the option to copy the components, and will remain connected to everything that it has behind. So I just want to show that why I'm creating a surface is because if you try to extrude a rectangle, which is just curve, as you see highlighted in here, it will only extrude the extrude command into type extrude, which also there's always multiple ways to multiple components to do the same thing. Just going to use this basic extrude. It's asking me for a base, which as you can see the description is asking for a curve or a surface, and that's because it differentiates between the two to make it a solid or a hollow extrusion. As you can see in here, any curve, anything that is just line, it will make it empty, as you can see in here with this one. And if I make it from a surface, as you can see in here, let's turn this off. When you extrude the surface, is a full solid. So that's why I'm using a surface instead of plugging in directly the rectangle to the extrude. Now, just going back into what the extrude component is asking me for, is asking for a direction, a extrusion direction. And sometimes this is a little bit confusing because you will want to give it a number, let's say 200, and you go directly into plug it in, it gives you an error. That's why you have to go back and be really careful. Okay, what is it that is asking for? Look at the angle. Okay, that's an arrow. Let's drag the parameter and just Control Alt, click. Okay, it's that one, and that is a vector. What happens if I type a vector? Okay, there's a few ones, and you can go trying to find the one that says create. That's a good way to use to find out a component that is useful. So this one is create a vector between 2 points. Okay, it's asking for a lot of more information. It's asking me for points, but I don't have any points. So what can I do? And here it comes handy to remember geometry and what we talk about Cartesian planes, Cartesian coordinates. And remember how we created a plane that is x, y, and x, z, all this. Just keep in mind that a vector, all of these Cartesian planes, x, y, and z, those are vectors. A vector is just a line that has direction. And the Cartesian planes have by default direction. Z is up, x is right, and y is left in this case. As you can see in Rhino, you can see always here in the corner as well, x, y, and z. So what I did is I just type, you can type any of those, x, y, or z, and it will give you the option in here. And you can always try to relate to those icons in here. You see that same arrow, you can go x, y, or z. If you type y, unit y as well. And then you have to, you can plug in the number to that one. Let's see what happens now. If I type it in Z direction, okay, now it's shredding. What happens if I use X direction? Now it's moving that direction. It is not really useful. That direction also not really useful. But as you can see, it's just starting to go into those directions. And again, just keep in mind, how is it that you find the information? Go into the icon, read what it's asking you for, try to understand what is it, what kind of information is that is asking you for, and what is it that you're going to obtain. Again, I like to just go back in here and see what's given me. To also get familiar with all the terms and different names that the software Grasshopper uses for different components, so you can also connect things. And finally, what I try to do to make an array, we can turn this on now. This is not too big. Let's make it the same as here. Let's make this smaller. This is when Grasshopper comes handy with the sliders to start adjusting things rather quickly and see what happens. So now I have this array. I just wanted to move those boxes in different directions, in this case use X and Y, and I just type array, and also multiple options. If you want to go into the Z direction as well, just make a box array. In this case, just rectangular array, very simple, X, Y. So that one, you can see is asking for geometry. Have that swirly black and white component. Something really good to keep in mind is that geometry, the component geometry in Grasshopper is basically everything. Anything that comes from geometry, rectangles, circles, cube, boxes, pyramids, cylinders, whatever it is, you'll probably be able to connect it into anything that says G or geometry. In this case, I'm just going to use the box and move it in X and Y, so my mind goes directly to the X and Y, and okay, it's asking me for a count, is a number, and is C. This is a good example of that number and integer differentiation. As you can see, this is asking for showing that 7 icon, as I showed in here. That number is 0.1 and integer is 7. So let's see what happens if I try to plug in something that is 3.5. and I plug it in there. And as you can see, it's actually every time that I move, it won't take anything until it gets after a certain point. So 4.0123, it's actually not doing anything because it doesn't know what to do. Grasshopper normally rounds up after 0.5, as is usual in a lot of systems. But again, it won't happen. Nothing would happen until it gets to the next roundup number. So 0.6, 7, 8, and 9 won't do anything. As you can see, until it gets a 5.5. So that's a good differentiation between those number and integer number. That sometimes it will be just better to keep it in round numbers, and that decimal points. And this one is just tries to round up, but some will give you errors and won't let you work with that. And it's simply that if you see a number, the same number of elements in the array, and you try to give it something with a decimal point, it might not work if it asking only for that 7 icon. Okay. Finally, something that would happen if I don't have that last number, that is one that is also a little bit confusing, is this C that is for cell. The cell, what it means, and it's asking for rectangular array cell. I can say the first time that I saw that, I wasn't sure what it meant. I was completely confused on what to use, until I just saw pay attention to the value that is by default right down the it says one locally defined value, a rectangle, W10 H5, and I immediately thought of the information that you can find when you plug in this rectangle information. That's why I like to connect everything that I create new into a panel, just to see what it's given me. That following logic and what we know, it would be a little bit hard to really understand that Grasshopper will ask you for a rectangle in this way. But after I saw that, and again, I didn't do this at the beginning, and now I recommend it to everybody. Just look at the icon, and you can do it again. Right click, extract parameter, Control Alt, and try to see where it's going, and try to follow that path of information to see what it's asking. And it's asking for literally a rectangle. So then you can connect a rectangle in there, any kind of rectangle. But what you want to do is you give it a rectangle that is actually the same or bigger than the original rectangle. So you can actually plug the rectangle where everything is coming from, which is this one that we used to create the base rectangle. But as you can see, is actually touching each of the cubes that we created, because it's exactly the same distance that we had before. But what we want to do, and I actually changed this to the wrong one, is that I'm just going to make an expression, something also quite useful to keep in mind for Grasshopper and its expressions. You can bring this by double click and type in actually expression. What it will give you is this little icon that you can double click again and start typing any math equation. And this goes back into algebra and arithmetic and all of that good stuff, but you can keep it simple as something like x plus y, and then you can just give it a number and just, let's say 10 for x, and just make it 7, and the result will be x plus y. but it gets fun when you start to using it with other components. In this case, I want to take the original number that is given it that I'm giving it to this rectangle component to create the base geometry that I have. I'm plugging it into that one, and I'm saying take that which is going to be x and plus 50, and then I'm just creating a new rectangle, and I'm going to show you now that is 100. And if I plug in that rectangle into the array now, you can see how that one is reacting to that one. And the good and important thing to understand here is that now, because I'm changing this base parameter, all of these rectangles and cubes are connected to each other. So if the rectangle grows or goes smaller, it's always going to keep the same distance of 50 units, 50 millimeters plus. And you might be wondering what happened with y, that when you bring an expression, let's bring a new expression, you get x and y. And some components in Grasshopper, what it happens is that you can come close and far away, and you'll see those plus and minus, and you can actually add whatever number that you want and create really complex formulas in here. And what I did in here is just, because I only need x, I just reduce from xy to be only x to make it more clean, to make it cleaner. And that's pretty much it for this video. I know a lot to take, it might take some time to get used to, but try to do everything that I did in here. Just try to follow along and try to experiment with the components, try to extract parameters every time that you're not sure what it means, and see what they have by pressing again Ctrl Alt and click all at the same time, keeping click pressed, and little by little you'll find more and more information. Always remember as well to connect panels everywhere to see what is it that you're obtaining. In this case, it's quite straightforward, it's basic shapes, but sometimes you are manipulating data and a lot of numbers, and it's good to have that. And as well to just get familiar with the names of everything and all the components that you're using. Alright, I would say that's all for this video. I wish you all the best, and I hope that you have fun experimenting with Grasshopper. Until the next video.